At a gathering with my husband's family, they humiliated me in front of our 3-year-old son, and my husband sided with them. Either apologize to my mother, he sneered, or pack your things and get out of my life. Fine, I'll go, I replied smoothly. I picked up my son, walked out to the driveway, and unlocked my custom Porsche Cayenne. My mother-in-law sprinted after me down the pavement, shrieking at the top of her lungs, "Leave the car, that belongs to my son." She actually believed the Porsche, and the very mansion she was standing in front of, belonged to him. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't just a quiet homemaker. I was a logistics officer, and every single asset they enjoyed was registered under my premarital trust. The next morning, my lawyer called him with a reality check that shattered their entire world. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and before I became a mother, I was an Army Reserve captain specializing in logistics for overseas operations. I spent years coordinating supply chains and asset movements in high-pressure environments where a single miscalculation could cost lives. Yet, to my husband Daniel and his mother Victoria, none of that mattered. To them, I was just the quiet, passive wife who stayed home, entirely dependent on Daniel's paycheck as a mid-level regional corporate manager. For 4 years of marriage, I played the part. I let Daniel puff out his chest at family gatherings, bragging about the promotions he didn't get and the extravagant lifestyle he claimed to provide. I tolerated Victoria's thinly veiled insults about my lack of ambition and how incredibly lucky I was that her son had rescued me from a difficult military life. I smiled through the patronizing pats on the arm, assuming that swallowing my pride and keeping the peace was better for our 3-year-old son, Noah. But peace built on a foundation of lies is just a delayed explosion. That explosion finally came during Victoria's birthday dinner, hosted right in my own dining room. The table was set with crystal, the expensive wine was pouring, and Noah was sitting quietly beside me. Out of nowhere, Victoria looked across the table, her eyes glittering with malice, and loudly declared that it was a tragedy Noah was growing up with a mother who didn't understand the value of a hard-earned dollar. When I firmly, but politely, asked her not to speak about me that way in front of my child, the room went dead silent. Daniel didn't defend me. He didn't try to de-escalate. Instead, he slammed his fist on the mahogany table, glaring at me with absolute contempt. "Either apologize to my mother right now," he snapped, his voice echoing off the walls, "or pack your things and get out of my life." The room went cold, but inside me, my military training instantly kicked in. I didn't cry. I didn't argue, scream, or try to reason with a man who had clearly traded his self-respect for his mother's approval. Instead, I calmly wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, set it down beside my plate, and stood up. Without saying a single word to Daniel or Victoria, I reached down, unbuckled 3-year-old Noah from his high chair, and lifted him into my arms. "Claire, where do you think you're going?" Daniel demanded, his voice laced with shock as he realized I wasn't falling to my knees to beg for forgiveness. I ignored him entirely, walking straight out to the grand foyer. I grabbed Noah's little coat, zipped him up, and grabbed my designer handbag from the hall table. Pushing open the heavy front doors, I walked out into the cool evening air toward the garage. I pressed the remote, and the smooth hum of my custom Porsche Cayenne echoed through the driveway. That was when I heard the frantic slapping of designer heels against the concrete. Victoria came sprinting out of the house, her face contorted in a mix of fury and hysteria. "Leave the car!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, waving her arms frantically in the dark. "That car belongs to my son. You don't get to take his luxury after disrespecting me in his house." I didn't even turn around. I strapped Noah securely into his car seat, shut his door, and turned to look Victoria dead in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lose my composure. "Get out of my way, Victoria," I said, my voice dead calm. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the estate, leaving her standing in the driveway, hyperventilating. As I drove toward a five-star hotel downtown, my mind shifted entirely into military logistics mode. Daniel and his mother thought they had just evicted a helpless wife. They had no idea they had just initiated a war with the wrong captain. Checked into a quiet, luxury suite downtown, I tucked Noah into bed, watching his peaceful breathing as the adrenaline in my veins finally settled. For 4 long years, I had let Daniel live in a grand fantasy, but tonight, he had shattered the unspoken contract that kept that fantasy alive. It was time for reality to crash down on him. What Daniel and Victoria completely forgot, or deliberately chose to ignore, was the simple truth behind our extravagant lifestyle. Long before I ever met Daniel, I had inherited a massive family estate portfolio and substantial military severance funds from my active duty years. When Daniel proposed, my late father's estate attorneys made it non-negotiable. I signed a bulletproof, ironclad prenuptial agreement, placing every asset, including our 5-acre suburban mansion and my custom Porsche Cayenne, into my personal premarital trust. Daniel's modest corporate salary barely covered his own tailored suits, his golf club memberships, and his mother's endless lunch tabs. Yet, out of pride, Daniel had spent years telling Victoria and his siblings a completely different story. He convinced them that he was the sole provider, that he had purchased the grand mansion, and that he was generously allowing his quiet wife to enjoy his wealth. I had let him play the big man because I loved him and wanted to protect his fragile ego. I thought my silence was an act of spousal devotion. Now, sitting in the soft glow of the hotel lamp, I saw his true colors. Daniel didn't just accept my generosity, he felt entitled to it. He was willing to publicly humiliate me and threaten my security just to stay on his mother's pedestal. The marriage was officially dead, and my logistics background told me it was time to execute Phase 2. At precisely 6 a.m. the next morning, I made my first call to Marcus, my family's estate attorney, and a former JAG officer who knew how to operate with ruthless efficiency. I didn't waste time on tears or emotional rants. I gave him a crisp, tactical summary of the situation. My marriage was over, and I was initiating immediate legal separation, full asset retrieval, and the complete revocation of all marital privileges. Marcus didn't even blink. Within 2 hours, he had drafted emergency petitions for sole residential custody and the formal enforcement of my premarital trust terms. While Daniel was sitting at his corporate office, boasting to his coworkers about how he'd finally put his wife in her place, my logistics strategy was falling into place like clockwork. By 11 a.m., an unmarked van pulled into the long driveway of the suburban estate. Inside were a team of bonded locksmiths and a private security team I had hired to secure the perimeter. They immediately went to work rekeying every deadbolt on the 6-bedroom mansion, recoding the electronic security system, and revoking the garage transponders registered to Daniel's sedan. Simultaneously, Marcus issued a directive to freeze every joint credit card and authorized user account. For 4 years, Daniel had been using cards linked directly to my personal trust accounts to finance his mother's lavish dinners, high-end shopping sprees, and his own country club dues. With a single keystroke from my bank manager, Daniel's financial umbilical cord was completely severed. He was still standing on the battlefield, completely unaware that his entire army had just surrendered. The bomb dropped on Daniel at 12:30 p.m., right in the middle of an expensive steakhouse lunch where he was treating his mother to celebrate, teaching me a lesson. When the waiter brought the bill, Daniel handed over his primary black corporate card, the one linked directly to my trust. Declined. Convinced it was a bank error, he handed over his secondary card. Declined again. Victoria ended up having to wash away her embarrassment by paying out of her own pocket, but the real shocker came the moment they walked out into the parking lot. A process server stepped out from behind a pillar and served Daniel with formal legal notices delivered directly from Marcus's office. As Daniel read the papers, the blood completely drained from his face. The documents clearly stated that the 5-acre estate belonged entirely to the Bennett family trust. His name was nowhere on the title, and his tenancy had been officially terminated. My phone exploded 2 minutes later. I answered on the third ring, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "What the hell is this, Claire?" Daniel screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "My cards are frozen. I just got served papers saying I can't enter the house. Victoria and I are standing in a restaurant parking lot. Have you completely lost your mind?" In the background, I could hear Victoria wailing, shrieking about how her son owned that house and how I was a thief. "I haven't lost my mind, Daniel," I said smoothly. "You told me last night to get out of your life. I simply complied. And I took everything that belongs to me with me. You have 2 hours to pick up your personal clothing from the security gate. Anything else will require a court order." 2 days later, Daniel and Victoria sat across from us in the main conference room at Marcus's legal suite. The transformation was dramatic. Gone was the arrogant corporate manager who had slammed his fist on my dining table. In his place sat a pale, disheveled man whose life was unraveling at lightning speed. Victoria sat beside him, clutching her designer handbag, her face pale as she realized they were no longer in control. Marcus didn't waste time on pleasantries. He opened a thick leather binder and laid out the cold, hard facts. He presented the original, ironclad prenuptial agreement, property deeds showing the mansion's sole ownership by my family trust, and the bank records for the Porsche Cayenne. "Mr. Bennett," Marcus said, his voice deep and authoritative, "your wife has been extraordinarily generous for 4 years. She allowed you to reside in her home rent-free and permitted you access to trust-backed funds. However, legally speaking, you own 0 equity in the primary residence, 0 interest in her vehicles, and have no claim to her premarital assets." Daniel stared at the documents, his jaw trembling. I contributed to the household," he stammered weakly. Marcus immediately slid a complete financial audit across the table. "Actually, your salary barely covered your personal debts, high-end tailoring, and club memberships. The record shows Mrs. Bennett funded over 92% of all household expenditures." Victoria gasped, looking at her son in utter disbelief. The wealthy, self-made man she had bragged about to all her friends was a complete illusion. She turned to me, her voice dropping into a desperate plea. "Claire, please. He's the father of your child. You can't just throw him out on the street." I looked at her with steady, unyielding eyes. "You told me to get out of his life, Victoria. I'm just making sure the exit is permanent." The legal resolution was swift and uncompromising. Facing a full financial audit that would have exposed how he mismanaged his own earnings and spent trust funds he had no legal right to, Daniel signed the settlement agreement without pushing for a trial. He surrendered every last claim to the estate, the vehicles, and my personal holdings in exchange for me, waiving any claim to reimburse the joint card expenditures. Within a week, Daniel was forced to pack up his remaining personal belongings in garbage bags and move into a cramped, 1-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of town, bringing his mother along with him, as she could no longer afford her lavish lifestyle without my trust floating her expenses. The grand fantasy they had built on my quiet generosity had completely collapsed, leaving them with nothing but the reality of their own limited means. As for Noah and me, we returned to our home. Walking through those front doors without the weight of toxic expectations or arrogant demands felt like taking a deep breath of fresh air for the first time in 4 years. I reclaimed my space, my peace, and my life, fully secure in my independence and ready to raise my son in an environment built on genuine respect, honesty, and strength. Standing up for yourself isn't always easy, especially when it means shattering an illusion that people you loved relied on. But keeping the peace at the expense of your self-respect is never a price worth paying. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have walked away as calmly as I did, or would you have fought back sooner? Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.